As a community of hope and love, we are woven together in the great web of life. We take time now to honor and share the joys and sorrows of our life, knowing that what touches one of us in so many meaningful ways touches all of us. Around the world, many events are unfolding that call out for our care and compassion. On this Human Rights Day, we pray for peace in our world, holding in our hearts all those affected by violence, those displaced by war, those held as prisoners of conscience, and those who labor in the cause of justice and peace. Knowing that so many issues here and abroad weigh on our minds, let us lift them up now in the spirit of community. As well, we carry with us today many concerns close to home. We hold in love and concern and prayer all those recovering from illness or surgery, all those living with ongoing pain, be it spiritual, physical, or emotional. We think of those working through conflicts or facing difficult decisions, those in a time of transition, and those finding it hard to get by. Let us now, aloud or in silence, lift up the names of anyone you may be carrying in your hearts. Mingled with our tears, there is joy among us, moments of celebration and gratitude and milestones of all kinds. The Jewish Awareness Group here in our congregation had a wonderful Hanukkah party on Friday night and have asked that we lift up gratitude for J.C. Morrison, our head custodian, for the work that he did in advance of Friday to polish the floors in Workman Hall. They said it was so clean and shiny that they could eat the potato latkes off the floor, which is not helpful to J.C. What other joys do we have to share? Congratulations.
Gratitude to Hope Hall and her team of volunteers who assembled and hung the beautiful snowflakes above us.
To be alive is to know both pleasure and pain. And as one body and community, we share with each other our sorrows and joys. May we live and breathe in the knowledge that we are not alone in our experience, but that we are held in the greater love that surrounds us in this room, in the wider world, and in the unfolding mystery of life itself. Amen. It is an honor to welcome today Tracy Aaron Smith, one of my dearest friends, to our pulpit. In place of the sermon today, Tracy and I will engage what we hope and trust will be a spiritually meaningful conversation. We have no idea what's going to happen. Many of you may recall Tracy's previous visits to First or know of her work as the artistic director of Solo Theater. She was the instigator and co-collaborator in creating the Clergy Project, the show that in recent years I've been a part of, that I co-created with a rabbi and a priest. At one point, Tracy felt called to be a rabbi, but on the way to rabbinical school heard instead the persistent call to the theater. I am so glad she did, because she does incredible ministry in our city and beyond through what she helps to put on stage. One of the things I most admire about Tracy is her passion for hearing other people's stories, even when, or more accurately, especially when, she does not share their same outlook on the world. Her open-heartedness astounds and inspires me on a regular basis, so I am so grateful that she is here today and able to share her wisdom and gifts with us. Now I invite you into our reading from the Palestinian-American poet Naomi Shihab Nye. It is entitled Jerusalem, and it begins with a quote from Tommy Olofsson. "Let's be the same wound if we must bleed. Let's fight side by side, even if the enemy is ourselves. I am yours, and you are mine." I am not interested in who suffered the most. I'm interested in people getting over it. Once, when my father was a boy, a stone hit him on the head. Hair would never grow there. Our fingers found the tender spot and its riddle. The boy who has fallen stands up. A bucket of pears in his mother's doorway welcomes him home. The pears are not crying. Later, his friend who threw the stone says he was aiming at a bird, and my father starts growing wings. Each carries a tender spot, something our lives forgot to give us. A man builds a house and says, "I am native now." A woman speaks to a tree in place of her son, and olives come. A child's poem says, "I don't like wars, they end with monuments." He's painting a bird with wings wide enough to cover 2 roofs at once. Why are we so monumentally slow? Soldiers stalk a pharmacy, big guns, little pills. If you tilt your head just slightly, it's all ridiculous. There is a place in my brain where hate won't grow. I touch its riddle, wind and seeds. Something pokes us as we sleep. It is late, but everything comes next. Let us join now in our next hymn, number 146, "Soon the Day Will Arrive."
And the children
So the camera's up there.
All right,
Okay.
so I'll speak this
Yes,
way.
yes. So it's probably fair for me to say a little bit about why you're here. You might be wondering
Sure.
why I've asked you here. Today is one of those days when it's a conundrum for a preacher to deal with all that's sort of on our plate. I mean, all the candles behind us. It's the second Sunday of Advent, it's Bodhi Day, it's International Human Rights Day, it's Hanukkah, which is a very complicated story, actually, when you get into it. Our theme for this month for our journey groups is hope, and we're doing this series of sermons on stillness. And so I thought I should invite Tracy. But seriously, knowing of the work that you've recently been doing, the trip you just came back from in Israel and Palestine, your recent visit to a prison in Los Angeles, and some of the conversations you and I've had, I think there's a connection between all of those things, and it runs through you. So
Wow.
go.
No problem.
Yeah, but for me, I think the hook is that in this stillness, what you've been learning around compassionate listening feels like an essential part of stilling that piece in us that might be unresolved in conflict or whatever. And so I think there are skills to learn there that are important. So this second Sunday of December, that's what I want us to offer people. So how was your trip?
Oh my gosh, thanks, Sean. The trip was amazing, devastating, shocking, eye-opening.
What do you feel like you got out of it? Like, what did you bring home?
I brought home a new perspective, an expanded awareness of the realities in Israel and Palestine. A love for people deepened, I think. One of the most magical things about the trip was, so it's called the Compassionate Listening Project. And I traveled together with 22 people. And these were 22 people who were willing to hear both sides. So we were there to listen to people on the Palestinian side and people on the Israeli side. And there's nothing really better than traveling with a busload of people that are willing to hear both sides. Because I knew that if things came up for me or I was triggered or I needed to talk about something, I could go to anyone on that bus and they would deeply listen to me. So that was amazing. And I'm also mentioning it because I feel that in this congregation whenever I've been here.
So what were the backgrounds of the people on the bus?
Everything, lawyers, professors, a number of lawyers and professors. I think I was actually one of the youngest participants. And
we're 29.
We are 29.
Yes.
You look amazing, Sean.
You do too, thank you.
And so people that were curious, I thought it was going to be all Jewish people on the trip. That's my background. And once I was actually there, I realized only 6 of them were Jewish. So as the trip progressed, and I felt like I was seeing damage that my extended family was doing, if I refer to Israelis and Jews in Israel as my extended family, and then I sort of put whispers through the Jews in the group. I was like, can we please have a meal together? I need to talk about what this feels like to be on this trip as a Jewish person and be in Hebron and be in the West Bank. So that was very helpful to process that.
Can I put you on the spot and ask what was that like?
There was a lot of tears. I have to say, so my ex-husband is Israeli, and he left there at 23 because he didn't agree with what was going on. And so when we would go back to visit his family, he did not really want to be there. And I found that there were points on the trips where I was crying from a deep compassion for him, because I really understood on a visceral level this conflict of the Jews are my people, and God, look what's happening.
And he was in the Israeli Defense Forces
Exactly.
too. So that's
Everyone
a big part
serves
of
in
his,
the army
exactly.
there. Yeah.
Yeah. I was struck when I was there a few years ago. It felt to me that it was an entire country with PTSD, is the way it felt to me.
So that's exactly what one of the conclusions I came to was the trauma on both sides, and it's intergenerational, and it's not talked about that much, because it's almost like they say, in the same way a fish doesn't see the water they live in, humans don't see the culture they live in. Yeah. And one of our leaders was a Jewish guy in his 30s who was raised in Israel, and he said, you know, Israelis don't talk about the trauma. They just can't. It's a militarized society, and it's just part of what is.
I was struck when we were there how tense it felt everywhere, and part of that is machine guns felt ubiquitous and that kind of thing, but soldiers everywhere. And we saw conflicts play out in Jerusalem at the Temple Mount when we were there. But I was struck by how when we went to the West Bank, I felt relaxed in a way that I had not been when I was in Israel, because the tensions there were palpable everywhere we went, and things felt more relaxed, strangely enough, in the West Bank and in the refugee camps that we visited, which I found very interesting.
Do you know why you think that is?
There were fewer guns.
Yeah, that's true.
But being on the other side of the wall, and at one point Bob and I went into a residence that was probably 10 stories tall in near Bethlehem, and we went to the top of the building and could look out. There was a guide with us, and you could look out and see the wall, because we were very close to it at that point, and see how it literally was cutting through an olive orchard, and had been cutting off the family that lived on the other side of the wall, or this side of the wall, from what had been their orchards. And it was it was such a scar in the landscape to see the wall making a jog intentionally to carve out that grove of trees.
Yeah, what's coming to me as you're saying that is it feels so, I saw that as well, it feels so against nature.
Exactly.
To separate the tenders, the growers from the beings that need them.
So we've been on both sides of that wall,
Yeah.
both of us, and I'm wondering, like, what do you feel like are the stories, or what are the lessons you take back from that experience that I think are relevant to any of us? I mean, in some ways we kind of look at that as, in some ways, the mother of all conflicts in the world, and if people in those situations can somehow begin to hear each other and find some peaceful way of being together, then what does that mean for the rest of us, or whatever conflicts we live in?
That's a great question. So one of the nights we were there, we went to visit Jana Jihad. So Jana Jihad is 12 years old now, and she is officially the youngest card-carrying journalist in the world. She started at 7 reporting from inside Palestine because she realized there wasn't a representation of the stories on the ground there. So we went to her home, and it was a really tense experience because we had just come from a settlement and spoken with a settler, and then we drove, I don't know, maybe half a kilometer, and now we're in the Palestinian home in a small village. And so we went in, and I've been watching her videos on YouTube, and we watched her home movie. So her uncle is her videographer, and he captures everything that happens. So her home videos are horror stories, and the next day, after we listened, the next day we were in a gorgeous cafe in Tel Aviv, and the contrast was a little bit cellularly unsettling. And as the 22 of us were sitting around next to the water in this beautiful cafe, I always had my notebook open, and I wrote a question, and I looked down, and it said, "What are we doing here?" And I could feel my heart racing, and I knew that this was a question I had to pose to the group. And I just asked them, I said, what are we doing here? Like, what are a bunch of tourists doing traveling around hearing these stories? What can this possibly do? And I said, if this is self-development tourism, I'm out. And it felt really like a risk to say that. I'm not quite sure where it came from, but it had to be said. And then as my heart raced, I listened to everyone kind of talk about and try to explain and grapple with what were we doing there. And the image that came to me is that we were acting as the fascia, which is the connective tissue within the body. And I felt that when we were doing our compassionate listening with one side, because of the safe, non-judgmental, no advice-giving space we were providing, that there was a relaxing in the side that was sharing their story. There was a bit of softening. And then we would go to the other side, and we would do the same thing, and there was a bit of softening. And so I had this image that we were sort of the connective tissue. And then that came to fruition. We were in a trauma center for Israeli children with a therapist. And we had also been in this incredible school called Hope Flowers for Palestinian children. And one of our members who'd done this trip before asked the therapist there, "Do you know about Hope Flowers?" And she said, "No, And he said, well, would you be open to me connecting you with this organization that's working with traumatized Palestinians? So the woman there said, yes, I would. You can set that up. And she also, when they asked her, do you have any hope? She said, I have no hope on the macro level, but I have hope on the micro level. So this leads me back to your question, which I think is most people that are willing to walk out of the safety of their own tribe and start to meet the other know that that's the only way it's happening right now.
So where do you think that courage comes from people to be people who are willing to do that?
So one of the things Jana Jihad said, I think when she was 10 years old, because a video went viral of her slapping and hitting an Israeli soldier who had his automatic rifle right there, and she's this tall, and she was just, I think her cousin had been in prison, and the words that she used when she spoke to us was, she said, and I had just had enough, and I knew I had to break through the barrier of fear. And I was like, out of the mouths of babes.
Yeah, she was 10 when she said that.
10.
Yeah.
And she knew, are we out of time?
That's our notice to let me know it was 11:30.
Or do you have to take the call?
No. Just want to keep it controlled.
Okay.
We have about 5 more minutes.
But it was, so I'll sort of sum up by saying, where I think the limits of compassionate listening are from when we listen to someone that hadn't been interacting with the other side, I found them to be one-storied, is a term I'm inventing. They were one-storied. They had been only listening to their own stories and people like them. And they had really weird stories about the other side. And then the same thing. They were one-storied, and I could tell they were in this loop of telling the story the same way. But the people who had found the chutzpah and the nerve and pushed through that barrier of fear to come together, they never said it was easy. It took time, it was slow, they got flack from the home bases, but they did it. Like combatants for peace are fighters from both sides that have put down their weapons and come together. These two women in their 30s, Maya and May, a Jewish and a Palestinian woman who met in a nonviolent communication where the Palestinian woman, Maya, was a violent activist. And then she took this gig because someone dropped out as a translator between Israelis and Palestinians in an 8-day intensive for nonviolent communications. So she literally, this is God's work, so she literally is sitting there having to translate the feelings and emotions from both sides coming through her being. And this changed her life. She hated it at first. And 8 days later, a softening, an understanding.
So that speaks to what it means to internalize somebody else's story, and then you can't help but see them differently on the other side of that.
So
right?
well said.
I'm thinking of the Rumi quote. So Rumi, the Sufi poet from the 13th century, who talked about out beyond ideas of right doing and wrong doing, there is a field, and I will meet you there. And it feels like that's what we're calling people to, right? Is to find that field where we can be in dialogue with people who for whatever reason are seeing the world differently than we do. And that feels to me like a healing space. And when I think about the Jewish notion of tikkun olam, the healing of the world, I think we need more of those kinds of spaces. And I'm struck, it's easy to look at the Middle East as just a conflicted situation and concentrate on that, but we all live with conflicted spaces in our lives. And so I think these ideas, these principles, can be used to call people to that courage in themselves to go out into that field. I'm wondering if there's anything you want to say about what people might employ themselves around compassionate listening. And I also want to say that I know the Compassionate Listening Project is based in Quaker and Buddhist thought. So there's a piece there, but what are the principles around this that people could use themselves?
So great question. So the first thing they say is sit with an open heart. And then when you're listening to someone, you're listening for 3 things: the facts, the feelings, and their values. And so you can mirror back to them, these are the facts, this is what I'm hearing you say. These are the feelings that I think you're having. And underlying that, these are the values. I think family is really important to you. I think justice, fairness is really important to you. And it's amazing how people's psyches and nervous systems relax when they feel heard. there's nothing left to fight against and prove. You're like, oh, they got it, they got it. And then you can ask what's called deepening questions. And it can't be something sneaky trying to guide them to your point of view or enlightenment or anything like that. It has to be something that you think might actually help them discover something they didn't already know based on what they said. And we've talked a bit about thin places, I think.
Right.
I'm writing a show about all this experience, and the show is called Thin Places, which is based on Celtic mysticism, which says that normally there's about 3 feet between us and the other world, and in the thin places is where the veil is the thinnest. And they usually refer to ruins or ancient ruins on the earth or different natural settings, or when you watch the wind blow through the leaves. And my theory and my personal experience is you can create thin places between human beings. And I felt that in the prison, and I felt that in Israel and Palestine. And then my latest thought is what gets in the way of that thinness? And the answer that came is thoughts.
So where's your hope these days?
Right here, Sean.
Okay.
Here
Good.
with you. My hope is that, where is my hope? I see change is possible because I am my best experiment and I am seeing change within myself. I also witnessed these brave, brave people that walked against the force of their tribes towards each other to connect. It's happening. It's beautiful.
Yeah, similarly, that's where I'm finding hope these days too. So I'm mindful you're going to be back with us on January 13th on Sunday afternoon from, I think, 12:30 for a 3-hour workshop about compassionate listening.
Yeah.
So all of us are welcome to take part in that.
Yeah, we're going to learn it, practice
So
it.
learn and practice how to do this. I'm deeply grateful to Eileen Cummings in the congregation who 10 or 11 years ago suggested that Tracy come to a class I was teaching here. So that has been a great and enduring gift in my life that is reaping benefits. So thank you for being here. Thank you for being in conversation. Tracy and I are talking about creating a podcast series that we're going to do. So you're kind of an experiment to see how this went.
How do we do?
We figure we're brilliant when we're having lunch or breakfast together. Like, other people should hear this. So we'll see how that goes.